Thank you. Hi, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here. We are thrilled to have you. And as David mentioned, we're going to be talking today about the future of cybersecurity in the year 2020. Now, that may seem like a very short amount of time, but so I just want to frame that point by pointing you to the slide over here, where we have a picture from 1956. These are some gentlemen from IBM who are pushing a 5-megabyte hard drive onto a truck. Now, these gentlemen probably could not have imagined the way that the technology would have developed today. And similarly, we feel as though technology is moving at even a faster clip now, and as a result, we need to start preparing for the future. So our center is organized in order to bridge 3 gaps. First, we feel that there's a great gap between the way policymakers and other real-world actors like companies are talking about cybersecurity and the basic research that academics are doing. What we'd like to do is try to bring those together, not to be the ivory tower on the hill, but to pull together real policy-relevant research in this space. Second, we feel that it's really important not just to consider the short-term issues of cybersecurity, today's hack, yesterday's vulnerability, but also to consider what the long-term will bring, how technology, how society, how the economy, how politics will change, and thus how we need to prepare for those eventualities. And third, we feel that technology is important, but that's not the whole story of cybersecurity. When I was at RSA recently, I was talking to a tech luminary, and that person told me, you know, we've got the technology bit down. What I'm really worried about is how humans are going to use that technology. And we agree that cybersecurity is often about the human touch, and so we need to take that into account. Now, our center is founded on the proposition that cybersecurity will become the master problem of the internet era. First, we feel that as technology is changing so quickly, the cyber will soon drop out of cybersecurity. With the Internet of Things and other connected devices, soon cybersecurity will just be security. We also believe that cybersecurity, the security aspect of that, will also continue to expand. Just as during the Cold War, we moved from a time when nuclear security was at the center of security to a time when other broader issues were brought in that umbrella. We feel like cybersecurity is moving towards that moment, and we're excited to see what opportunities that brings. Our center really works on 3 different streams to help accommodate these different problems. First, we're focused on research. We've given out over $1 million in grants to at least 25 different organizations trying to build cybersecurity research, covering issues that you might expect, like social manipulation, but also covering issues like artificial intelligence and biosensing that you might not yet see at the center of cybersecurity. Second, we're focused on education. We really believe that the pipeline problem is a core problem of cybersecurity, and so we're seeking to develop new ways to bring education both to UC Berkeley students and to the broader community of people moving into this field. And third, we're really focused on partnerships, whether that be community partnerships, policy partnerships, or developing other relationships so that we can move from that ivory tower on forward. And underlying all of our work is an experimental model. We believe that traditional activities are not the only way to think about how to develop cybersecurity, and we're going to give you an example of what we mean by that right now. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass the podium over to my colleague Steve Weber and let him tell you a story.
Thank you, Betsy. I'm just, I think, mic'd up here, so in fact, I'm going to step down so I don't trip. I get the opportunity to tell you a story in a galaxy a long, far time away, but actually no. This is a story about a time that is actually very close to the present. And it's one of several stories. Let me begin by showing you what that story looks like. This story is called Bubble 2.0. And it's first and foremost a story about financial markets and how a change in financial markets could really dramatically shift the landscape for the cybersecurity problem. So take a look at this graph. To some people, this graph of market capitalizations of some companies in the valley looks as crazy as Pets.com did in 1999. To some people, this looks as crazy as credit default swaps did in 2008. To some people, this looks absolutely rational and reasonable. And in fact, this is probably one of the most heated debates in the Bay Area right now. Here's the one thing that everybody does agree upon. Nobody knows for sure, but here's what we do agree upon. These companies are being valued not on the basis of the services they provide, but on basis of expectations about the value of the data they collect while they provide those services. And so the argument for the defenders, as you have no doubt seen, is, quote, this time there are real business models. Maybe. Nobody knows for sure. Everybody knows that the four most dangerous words in any financial market is, this time is different. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. This story explores what happens if actually maybe it isn't different. In finance theory, this is called castles in the air. And this is sometimes what people do when they develop models of valuation. And in our recent lifetime, we've all seen twice now castles in the air come spiraling down. And we know how it happens. Expectations change, valuations plummet, people panic. Expectations change even more, valuations plummet even more, people panic even more. And suddenly, those castles in the air become a death spiral. And so I want you, for the next few minutes, to imagine with us what would happen if, in fact, that were the future of data-intensive business models. And one of the ways to think about that is to ask ourselves, what happened in 2008? How did people respond when this happened in the mortgage default credit swap space? And there was a very famous slide deck that some of you may have seen. It's almost legend in the Valley, from Sequoia Capital. Sequoia Capital, one of the largest investors in the region, venture capital firm, went around to all the companies that it had invested in and showed this slide. Showed this slide. That was the first slide in the deck. As you can tell, it wasn't an optimistic view. They went around and were telling their companies, look, the good times are over. And now the game is different. And this is the new game to which you must adjust. This was the last slide in the deck, in which it told people what to do. On the continuum between preserving capital and developing new products and innovating, you were supposed to be all the way over. Preserve capital, and most importantly, cash is king. Raise money to survive. And so now I want you to think about what would happen if today's data-intensive business model firms were put in the position where they simply had to raise cash in order to survive. Well, what recoverable assets do they have in their portfolios? I remember in 2000, the main recoverable asset were Aeron shares, and they went on the market. I remember in 2008, a large number of houses went on the market. But the thing that these firms have, which they would have to sell to raise cash, are in fact data sets. So I want you to think about a world in which these data sets are suddenly for sale on a market, all of them. What does that world look like? And what would that mean for cybersecurity? So think about a world in which all those data are sold off in fire sales, auctioned, maybe stranded in bankruptcy, bought by governments, stolen. It's pretty easy to imagine a war for data under some of the worst possible circumstances that anyone would ever want to encounter in a marketplace. Financial stress, people panicking, ambiguous who actually owns that data sets that for sale? What's the quality of those data assets that I only have a few minutes to decide whether or not I'm going to buy or not? Does the price represent any realistic assessment of what that data is worth? And oh, by the way, there's data trolls everywhere trying to pick up assets on the cheap. So what happens then? Well, one thing we know for sure. Nobody steals cars from a salvage yard. And so for all the effort that's being put today into stealing data sets, into getting access to social graphs, people who may want to have your medical record, people who may want to have your credit card receipt, people may want to have all sorts of data about you as a person. Well, today, they have to steal it. In this world, why steal when you can buy it for cheap on a distressed asset market? Sounds like bad news, right? But it's not all bad news. We know, and have lived again through this twice, underpriced assets in distressed asset markets are wonderful things for the people who can pick up new opportunities on the cheap. And in fact, they are a major driver of the next generation of innovation. So we saw that twice in the last decade. There was a lot of dark fiber that came onto the market, cheap. There were engineers who were unemployed and needed jobs. They were cheap. There was intellectual property that was cheap. The people who had paid for it lost. The people who got to buy it cheaply drove new and incredibly interesting businesses. So imagine 2017. Now you can buy data assets cheap. You can buy data scientists cheap. And you can buy algorithms really cheap. If you're in the legal world, there's a lot of cool businesses you can build. If you're in the illegal world or the illicit world, there's a lot of really interesting criminal enterprises that you can build as well. So what happens in a world like that? This is what we want to explore with you. Well, here's a couple of quick ideas about how this might change the environment for the cyber world. Just imagine for a minute what it would feel like if a company that was an icon of the era, a company like Twitter, announces on a Friday afternoon, let's say after the close of the stock market, that as of Monday morning, it is ceasing service, just shutting down. That's going to sort of set off a mental, emotional twist in people's minds. Like, it's now a really different game. And here's the kind of things that we'll see on the other side of that. You can say goodbye to some of the things that we have taken for granted as driving the internet economy and essentially creating the foundation on which cybersecurity lays. Free content, subsidized devices, cheap services, freemium business models. I got to say for myself, I will not be sad to see the word freemium go away. But say hello to even more resistance to spending on cybersecurity than we even see today, because the budgets will be down. And say hello to a large number of unemployed data scientists who believed that they were going to have extraordinarily high-paying jobs who are now unemployed and looking for work. And the proposition to them is as attractive and interesting from the illegal world as it might be from the legal world. What happens to government in a world like that? Well, I want you to imagine for a moment a memo that goes from Mark Zuckerberg to the President of the United States that mimics the memo that went from GM to the President of the United States and says, my company is responsible for 2 million jobs. My company is in financial distress. The only way I can keep this thing going is to sell those data assets. And by the way, the buyer out there is a Chinese firm named Baidu or Tencent. Unless, of course, you bail me out. What would the government do in a situation like that? I don't think we've really thought about that problem yet. I think you can imagine the political and economic sort of ramifications of even thinking about a troubled asset relief program for data assets. It was hard enough to value those assets in 2009. And if the government were to actually buy up some of those assets, even with the notion of holding them in escrow, maybe Facebook isn't really insolvent, it's only illiquid. And so what we ought to do is buy up those assets and then sell them back out into the marketplace when markets re-equilibrate. Well, data that today is held by Facebook, which is already a little anxiety-provoking about people's privacy, once it's held by a government, that's a very different conversation. And again, it's all not all bad news. Countries that are behind in the data economy, which of course is basically everybody in the world except the United States, would now see an opportunity to jump into that game at low prices and quickly by buying up some of those assets themselves. So what do the criminals do? Well, lots of options. The one sort of that appeals to me is what I like to think of as the Michael Corleone maneuver, and I mean that for Godfather 2. Why stay in the illicit world if you can move into the legitimate world and the move is cheap? So that's one thing you could do. Another thing you could do is buy up a bunch of different data assets that aren't actually so clear to steal, like wasn't obvious what you would do if you would put them together. So it wasn't worth the risk of stealing them, but if they're cheap, why not buy them, put them together, and see what you can get out of it? Another thing you could do is recognizing that the new owners of those data assets are probably not going to understand exactly what they need to do to protect them. You could go attack those data sets where they land at their new owners. You could attack the data markets themselves, since they probably won't be functioning terribly well. And if you're sort of minded in the intelligence or counterintelligence world, maybe you would act as a cutout intermediary for other governments that want data that is relevant to national security or even national competitiveness. So now it's not the government that's buying that data set, it's just some private firm set up by a criminal. I'm sure there are lots of other options. That's what we want to get people thinking about. So look, in this story, what does cybersecurity mean? Pretty different from what most of us think of as cybersecurity today. Today, we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that the bad folks don't get access to our networks, because we don't want them to steal our data. In this world, they have access to our data. They can buy it. So now we have to shift our attention from preventing access to controlling what people can do. That's not a new idea, but it will become a profoundly urgent one in this world. Second, today, we think of things like personal authentication, telling the network I am who I say I am, as one of the most critical functions in securing data. In this world, provenance of the data set, like provenance in an art market, right, is critical. Is the data set really what it says it is? How good is it? Does it come from who it says it comes? Where was it driven from? Who actually created that data set? Is it what it says it is? Property rights in a market like that. You know, today, if you think about intellectual property rights and sort of the ambiguity around some of this data, it feels like an economic issue, an ethical issue, a business model issue. In this world, it's a national security issue. Who actually owns that data? And then finally, again, the data scientists. You know, many of us will remember in 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were a bunch of nuclear scientists who essentially came onto the market for the highest bidder. In this world, the data scientists are the nuclear scientists. We're going to let them just go to the highest bidder, or are we going to try to intervene to sort of stop that market from operating? So look, this is just a story. And I want to tell you briefly how this story came to be, because the real objective here is, what do you do with a story like that? So we decided that what the world needed, and what we thought the cybersecurity world would benefit from, would be a disciplined look into really what is a short-range future in some respects, 2020. It's only 4 years away. That's not what we typically think of as really long-term planning. But in a world that is in some ways appropriately obsessed with today's challenge, 4 years sometimes seems like a long time. And so we adopted a methodology that many of you are probably familiar with, scenario thinking, scenario methodology, to try to create several models of how cybersecurity landscape might change and look different around 2020, with a focus not on what would be the same, or not what would be a little bit more than what we see today, but would be different from what we see today. And here's the basic schematic for thinking in this way. It's really very, very simple. The idea is that we kind of know where we are today in some respects. And if we think really hard, we can begin to isolate and specify the most critical uncertainties that might impact the cybersecurity landscape moving forward. And if we take those critical uncertainties and we layer them against each other, and we combine them and we stretch them out to about 2020, we create a cone of uncertainty. And any cone at the top has a kind of oval. And that oval represents almost like a landscape of possibilities. And so what we've tried to do is mark out the circumference of that landscape, the edges. And we've done that by creating 5 scenarios. They were described very briefly in the pamphlet on the chairs. We have much longer and more detailed descriptions in a publication that Betsy is going to talk about a little bit later. But the point is, none of those things are predictions. They're just a landscape. And if we get it right, if we're anywhere near right, then the future will fall somewhere in the middle of that oval. And It's a very, very useful tool for a very simple reason. If you think of scenarios not as predictions, but as a planning model, it becomes very hard to beat. Here's a classic story about how it works. Very briefly, many years ago, we did a scenario workshop, a plan for an express package delivery company that was concerned about something called the avian flu. The idea was, what if the avian flu gets much worse and ports shut down, air transport shuts down? How would we run our business in a world like that? How would the landscape change? Turns out, as you remember, thankfully, the avian flu wasn't that bad. But just a few years later, this volcano, I won't even try to pronounce the name of the volcano, erupted in Iceland. Some of you may remember this. I remember it very vividly. I was stuck in Moscow for 10 days. More importantly, this express package delivery company had a plan for what to do if air transport in Europe shut down for a week. Not because they had predicted the future, but because they had planned for the landscape. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get people to plan for the landscape. We're trying to get people to research the landscape. There are 5 of these scenarios, as I said. There's just some graphics that represent what they are, described in detail. I just want to tell you briefly one more quick story about what this might look like. Different story. This story is called Sensorium. And you might think of it for the moment as the internet of emotion, or the internet about emotion. So, these wearable devices. How many people in the room right now are wearing one of these things? How many people have one of these things sitting in their desk drawer? Because you bought one, you wore it for a while, and it's not that interesting anymore, right? And I have about 5. Here's the thing. Unless you're like a fitness freak or a quantified self-geek, the data that what these things tell you is sort of interesting, how many steps I took. But I wouldn't call it life-changing. And for most of us, if a government had access to that data, or if a criminal stole it, it probably wouldn't upset us all that much. Okay? So this is what we got today. Here's what's coming. Or in fact, what is already available today. This is a device called the Thync, T-H-Y-N-C. And I'm actually not representing the company, but it's a pretty cool looking little device. It costs $199, and it is a dry EEG device. So the data coming off this thing is pretty rough. In a few years, it's going to be quite precise. I want you to think about what happens when I combine this data with galvanic skin response, resistance, with heart rate and breathing variability, with all the other little pieces of data which we'll put together, and we will have insight into, and you will have insight into, your real-time emotional state. That's pretty interesting. Not how many steps you took, but how you feel at this given moment. That's a different world. Here's how you know it's true. In 2020, a presidential candidate running in an election is not just going to release her tax returns. And that's kind of interesting. She's going to release her emotional history, which is going to tell you over the last 5 years how she responded to stressful situations, how she responded to anxiety-producing decisions, what she's like in a tough meeting. And you'll be able to audit that. In 2020, the NFL is going to outlaw the use of emotional sensing data on offensive and defensive linemen. And the reason it's going to do that is because your Redskins are going to try to steal data from my New York Giants. Because you're going to try to engage in emotionally specific trash talk by stealing the emotion data of Jason Pierre-Paul's emotion device. And by the way, it's not going to work. We're going to beat you anyway. And the NFL is going to outlaw it. And for those of you who have used or been subjected to the Myers-Briggs test, forget, that's the past. Now your employer is going to want to have a specific emotional history of how you respond to conflict in meetings. And this is DC. Are there any lawyers in the room? For those of you who are lawyers, right? When you want the contract negotiation, the history of a contract negotiation, was there a meeting of the minds? Is that a valid contract? You'll be able to read that data from someone's emotional history. By the way, all of that data, of course, also ready for criminals, governments, marketers, and anyone else to steal. So with apologies to Tim Cook, who said this about the Apple Watch, this is the most personal technology ever invented. Okay? But it's also the most profound source of insecurity that I can imagine. Because after all, we know from intuition and science, none of us are rational actors. I can learn a lot about your incentives. I can think a lot about how to move the rational levers of your decisions, but it is emotion that unlocks human decision-making at scale. And that's why people want to understand how you feel about any given decision, any given action, any given event in the world. It unlocks you in a way that no one has ever been able to unlock human beings at scale. How quickly could this happen? Well, I'm sure you're familiar with this data. The iPod was the fastest thing ever, except for the iPhone, which was then the fastest thing ever, except for the iPad, which was then the fastest thing ever. And the emotion device, I'm not making a prediction, but I'm going to tell you that I believe this technology will be so compelling to people that it will be hard to resist. We'll put it on ourselves because it's so interesting, because we want insight into our own states. And because some of us are going to feel like if we don't do it and others do, we're operating at a competitive disadvantage. Some of my colleagues in the privacy world think privacy will stop this. I'm going to ask you to think again. First of all, like I said, this is going to be the most compelling thing you've ever been sold by the technology industry. Creepy factor? For sure. You want to hear about what's really creepy with this technology. If this technology has access to your real-time emotional state, and it knows exactly where your creepy factor starts, it can calibrate itself so it stays just on the right side of that creepy factor. Now that's creepy. But it's so creepy that you won't even know it's doing it. So what does that look like at scale? Well, imagine a couple things. So in 2019, I'll have my Apple iPhone 12 with iOS 11. They never can seem to get those things in sync. And it's going to have emotionally verified emojis on it. And I'll be able to send them to my friends. People may try to steal them from me. I'll never have to fill out a customer survey satisfaction again, because everyone will know exactly how I feel. Facebook will have a product called Mood History, which will tell you exactly how you have felt about certain things over the last couple of years, and interestingly, we'll be able to predict. Tomorrow, I don't know, maybe you should stay home from work tomorrow, because it's really the best thing for you. Or maybe you should go to work and really double down and finish that piece of work you're working on, because that's what really will make you happy. And you will think this is kind of hokey and farcical until you see that it works better than you ever could have possibly imagined. And you'll want it. And finally, your employer's emotional rating system. Remember that really tough meeting where somebody lost their cool? Somebody's going to get a raise, and somebody's going to get anger management counseling. And that's what this data is going to be able to do. My favorite is what I call Machiavelli's revenge. Machiavelli, in his advice to the Italian prince, famously said, "It is better to be feared than loved as long as fear does not turn into hatred." And I think political leaders and CEOs have taken that message to heart, except when they cross the line and get it wrong, that's how they get deposed. Now they're going to have access to that data at scale, and the more ruthless ones will be able to walk right up to that line and stay there. That's a source of pretty significant political power. OK, so let's take that. What does cybersecurity look like in that world? Let's end with this thought. Cybersecurity now is emotional manipulation. That's a really different world than the world we're living in. When I hear people talk about identity theft today and say, somebody stole my bank account number, somebody stole my social security number, that's not my identity. I mean, that's a problem, causes a nuisance, but that's not who I am. My emotional history, my most intimate moments, and how that's who I am. Try to recover from that data breach. Imagine what that looks like. Think about the narcissists and the marketers in your life who were trying to move you to do things. In fact, sometimes they're the same people, right? Now imagine that with precision at scale. And finally, social engineering. Spear phishing emails that tap into a kind of general vague anxiety that everybody has a little of, like my bank account's been shut down, or somebody has my credit card number. Now imagine spear phishing with precision awareness of what it is that people really fear and what they really desire, individual, granular, precise. That's social engineering. And what if you're a terrorist? I mean, the whole point of a terrorist, as I understand it, is to induce terror, an emotional state on a population. Right now, people make assumptions about how to do that. In this world, they know precisely how to do it. So look, those are two little stories. The point of these stories is, again, not to make predictions, but to start arguments about what would we do in a world like that. And so we've made an effort to look across a set of scenarios and ask ourselves, what do we learn from looking at that entire landscape? And I want to end with just a couple really quick insights that I think are pretty important about that. First, Betsy hinted at this, and I'm going to say it even more strongly. We believe that cybersecurity is becoming an existential challenge, a lot more like climate change than credit card fraud, to the societies in which we live. The center of corporate, national strategy, and personal experience. Nobody questions, really, that the internet has changed the way we live. Nobody questions that mobile, actually, in the last couple of years, has really changed the way we live. Business models, politics, personal experience. We think security is the next version of that for the next 5 years. Right? And so if you're in a firm, the things that rise to the C-suite level, like the emergence of a disruptive new competitor, cybersecurity rises to that level in the next couple of years. If you're in a national capital, the big geopolitical forces that move history, the emergence of a peer competitor, a transnational terrorist organization with strong ideology. We think cybersecurity is moving right to the same level, the same plane of importance. And for individual people, as I said, for most of us, cybersecurity is a nuisance, a tax. But I think back to my parents' generation, walking to work with the awareness in the 1950s that there was this thing out there called mutually assured destruction hanging over their heads on any given day, and seeing the signs for the nuclear fallout shelters as they walked to work. And it changed the way they thought about life. It changed the way they thought about their families. It changed the way they thought about their relationship to a government which could no longer promise to protect them. That's where I think the cybersecurity world is headed. And the one insight that I can say about that is our society's institutions are nowhere near ready for a world like that. And we got to get ahead of that. Second simple insight, no silver bullet, as long as human beings are involved. And human beings will be involved. Here's the major reason why. It was actually Jonathan Day who made this observation to me. This technology is so compelling that people's demand for what it can do will expand to fill the space of what is technologically possible, and then always just go a little bit beyond. And as that happens, when we go a little bit beyond the frontier of what's possible, it is always the case that the bad actors, the illicit actors, have the advantage. That's the history of pornography, it's the history of smuggling, it's the history of graft, and it is, up till now, the history of cybersecurity. It's just going to accelerate in the next few years. And the technology is going to get better on both sides. And I know I'm not supposed to make predictions, but I can predict right now that our passwords will get better. Our biometric authentication will get better, and it won't be enough. And it won't be enough because there is no technical or behavioral intervention that is so powerful that it can overcome human stupidity. Or maybe I should say more politically, will stop people from creating insecurity by what they do. No silver bullet. Last thought. Don't count on government. Now, it may seem sort of strange to say that in Washington, D.C. But in the world where I live, down here in the Silicon Valley, people talk the talk of public-private partnership, but they don't walk the walk. And I think we have seen this very visibly in the encryption debate over the last few months. The fundamental belief among most technology people in the Valley is, look, if the government would just stop mucking around in our business and let us do what we know how to do, we will solve this problem with technology and markets. And I think the fundamental belief up here in Washington to a certain degree is, look, those guys out in the technology industry, and they are mostly guys, don't quite get it. They don't understand, with their fascination with words like disruption, innovation, short-term market returns, and what consumers want, that they are creating a national security nightmare. And so everybody says we need public-private partnerships. Everybody says government and the private sector need to work together. But when the time comes and the push comes to shove, they don't do it very well. And we have got to get out ahead of that problem and fix that sooner rather than later. Because here's the one thing, or the second prediction I'll make, and I'll end with it. Societies that can do that, that will be more successful, are going to be societies that are going to be vastly advantaged in this new era of cybersecurity going forward. So let me end and thank you. The whole point of this is to provoke a conversation. We hope you'll engage with us in that conversation. And this is just a start. So thank you for your patience.